All right, well, welcome to our third panel of the day, Technology and Great Power Competition, Views from the Region. I'm going to introduce the moderator, who will then introduce the panelists. The moderator is my friend and colleague, Graham Webster, who's a research scholar here at Stanford. Also the founder of the DigiChina project, which is one of the best resources out there on all things China digital technology policy. Graham, over to you.
All right, thank you, Andy. Thanks everyone for being here and for sticking with us after lunch. We'll try to keep it exciting. We are going to talk about great power competition and technology. We call it views from the region, but I'm thinking of this really in a frame of regional politics, international system, alliance system. How does all this fit together? We have three wonderful panelists to get us going on this. And as we've been doing all day, we'll have a fairly informal conversation here on the stage, and then keep, I hope, a good amount of time for questions. So to my immediate left is Jeremy Chang. He's a legal researcher and policy think tanker. He's Chief Executive Officer and Director of Economic Security Research at the Research Institute for Democracy, Society, and Emerging Technology under the National Science and Technology Council in Taiwan. He has broad experience. He's written recently and co-written in-depth reports on the semiconductor ecosystem and what Taiwan and the United States and allies might do about the geopolitics of semiconductors. He was a postdoc at Harvard and earned his PhD from Kyoto University and an LLM from Cornell Law School. So he has a wonderfully international perspective on these issues to bring. Also with an international perspective is Kemy Monahan. We're lucky to have her here at Stanford as a visiting scholar in the Japan program at the Shorenstein Asia Pacific Research Center here at FSI. She's served 30 years as a Foreign Service officer with the State Department, most recently as Deputy Chief of Mission in Japan, and has served also in Papua New Guinea, in high positions in Papua New Guinea and New Zealand. In addition to other places around the world, she began her career as a lawyer and as a member of the bar in California, DC, and we'll have both a perspective from working in Japan recently, but also as a person practicing statecraft and diplomacy for the United States over a very consequential period of time in technology. Last but not least, we have Professor Ji-Young Lee, a political scientist. Professor Lee is at American University, has written broadly on East Asian regional international structures, and really has a deep perspective on the way that that U.S. allies and other states in the region navigate the geopolitics and the broad flow of international events and politics in East Asia and the Pacific. So, that sets us up for a great discussion. I'm pretty excited. I wanted to start. Of course, as Andy mentioned, I study primarily Chinese tech policy and U.S.-China relations, although my study of East Asia started with Japanese language and study abroad in Japan, and then got into Sino-Japanese relations. So I came from a somewhat regional perspective, but I've now spent 20 years pretty much entirely focused on China. And in this tech focus, one of the things that I've been digesting and that we're going to talk about today, and some of it's already been on the table, is what are the technological aspects of U.S.-China relations? And I'm going to give an opening thought that's a provocation, then I'll turn to our panelists for some thoughts, and I've got a series of topics here. But for countries in the Asia-Pacific region, US-China relations obviously looms large. These are the two largest military and economic powers. Anybody who lives in the region is kind of in the center of gravity of China as a physical space, but the military and economic presence of the United States is felt everywhere. There's all kinds of different ways in which technology figures into the US-China dynamic there. There's a contest in many ways for dominance in the minds, I think, of both governments. We see that in the export controls on semiconductors that are attached to the ideas of AI futures that we've been talking about today. All of the sort of tools that the US government uses, entity listing, other sanctions, things looking at the military. There's this concern about if it comes to blows, who will have the advantage, right? So truly a hard power dominance. And then there's sort of prosperity or money-making or just economic advantage. And there's a huge amount of competition there. We see everything from, should China join the WTO? Well, it turns out that it did. Should the United States lead the negotiation of the Trans-Pacific Partnership? Well, it did, and then it didn't join the thing. But there's this question in technology whether prosperity is a winner-take-all dynamic with AI that's going to take off and change everything, or a much more textured, competitive environment between the US and China and with highly complex supply chains. We have all these other ways in which the two big powers go at each other with punitive export controls, things from the US targeting human rights abuses and market behavior. There's worries about vulnerability to one another. On the US side, blocking effectively banning the import of Chinese electric vehicles and connected vehicles at the end of the Biden administration. In the Chinese context, having a huge amount of controls over what types of IT systems can be installed. Then there's a whole bevel of retaliatory dynamics where once one side gets going on something, you have something like came out a few weeks ago from the Chinese side saying we're going to potentially control and constrain the flow of rare earths around the world over disagreements with the United States. Finally, there's this baseline entanglement and common interests that the two large powers and everybody else in the region have. And when entanglement is everything from economic to strategic stability and security. Supply chains we all felt very acutely during the COVID period. It gets down to undersea cables, which are a huge dependency for each economy and hugely relevant for Taiwan, Japan, and South Korea as well. I did want to end though on the common interests. There's, we experienced a failure of common interest behavior on, in the pandemic period. We had a potential for the United States and China and many other countries to cooperate and, minimize damage. And that's not what they did. There was a lot of recrimination instead, and things were not very well coordinated. There's an interest in decarbonization, climate mitigation, and adaptation, which sometimes has actually been quite successful and right now looks a little bit shaky. And at the bottom of all of this, there's a need for strategic stability. Nobody benefits from a slip into war among the United States and China or anybody else in the region. As everybody knows, there's a huge US military presence in Japan and South Korea. US security relations with Taiwan are not quite the same, but highly sensitive, as everyone knows. Somehow these states would probably prefer to avoid experiencing any of those contingencies. The end of my little introduction here is we've seen for a few years, now probably a decade, a focus on what most people call decoupling. Something, especially in tech, there's something about the level of interdependency, interconnection that led to insecurity experienced in the United States and China. But this, travels across many states. If the US and China feel insecure relying on each other for supply chains or being too connected and with systems that have cyber vulnerabilities, then those vulnerabilities are felt across all of the regional societies. There's probably some sweet spot, I would offer, of decoupling, partial separation that would allow all of the states of the region to have greater confidence in their security, but also maintain the ability to benefit from some of the positive interactions that these states have, starting with the strategic security, but also up to cooperation on all the other issues, things like I mentioned in climate and public health, and just making a lot of money together, which is used to be a great animating issue. So, I wanted to start with that. When I was getting ready for this panel, I was doing a little research, and I discovered that Professor Lee had written a paper a few years ago. And if you don't mind, I'll start with you, but I want to read a few words from this. This is from a paper co-written with two co-authors called Decoupling from China, How U.S. Asian Allies Responded to the Huawei Ban. And the way they summarize some of their findings here, which I found really fascinating, was that there's a concept of an alliance halo. And they say the expectations that are established by the alliance halo, this is the things not in the agreement, but where it seems like probably your allies should play along with you. They say these extra expectations are likely to result in fear of political entrapment, multifaceted hedging, and threats of abrogation in the relations with allies. So, this is the very tidy language in there. But what we're talking about is expectations from the United States or from U.S. allies looking at the United States can complicate matters and sort of get everyone into a bit of trouble. And since we've been so focused on specific tech policies, I thought in this panel we might look at the broader geopolitical frame. And Professor Lee, can I ask you to tell us a little bit more about that alliance halo and how you think the Huawei situation helps explain the geopolitics of tech in the region?
Thank you, and thank you so much for taking a look at our paper. Thank you everyone for being here. I have been learning a lot and enjoying this event tremendously. So let me actually take a step back and think about all these discussions in the context. Naturally, when the United States face challenges with China, the trusted partners become U.S. treaty allies, right? But actually, if you think about the origins and the formation of these alliance relationships, it was against existential external threats, right? But in 21st century, including these discussions about AI and cybersecurity, it actually doesn't come to a point of the threshold that invoke the treaty allies to come together and actually take joint action. Cybersecurity, disinformation, economic coercion, et cetera, So when US and its allies trying to come together and address these challenges that are less clear-cut, right? It actually creates a different set of dynamics in the region for its international relations with implications for the international order. Previously, this alliance halo, this concept by Snyder, refers to this understanding, mutual understanding, even when stuff happens in international affairs, when we are allies, right? Even when it is not come to a point of being attacked by an external entity, because we actually share the commitment of protecting each other in the event of such an event, there's understanding that you have to be, helping me out. So that's the area that Alliance Halo covers. So in a sense, when Trump administration, Biden administration, especially I actually look at the case of Huawei, it actually is not physical attack, but this is really serious. So, the Trump administration went to its allies and asked to join the Huawei ban. But what we found out is that allies actually has a very, responses to the ban. And it actually had a lot to do with the fact that China is not like the Soviet Union during the Cold War era. Too many South Korean public and policymakers, they were concerned, but it's not so clear what exactly this threat is. Is this a threat? So when I actually compared Korean and the Japanese responses to Huawei ban, because the United States actually shared, we're not so sure if we feel safe to share sensitive information, even if you're my ally, if you use Huawei equipment. So South Korea actually did the bare minimum, I think, from the government perspective. South Korea said, we don't really want to make a decision. Basically, it's a strategy of not making a decision between Washington and Beijing. So actually let the companies make their own decisions. But the only thing that they did at the start of the Huawei, issue, they did the complete count of all the equipment in the South Korean military and actually collected back all the equipment that use Huawei equipment. That's about what the government did. There was no ban on government procurement. It was actually up to companies to decide. Whereas in Japan, because they actually do share the wariness towards Chinese intentions, they went ahead. Japanese government actually was very careful in words, rhetorically, they were very quiet, low profile, but in action, very decisive. Japanese government actually gave this, two companies directives. Please be careful. So actually, they effectively banned and joined the United States to ban Huawei. So what this means for the future of U.S. alliance network, when U.S. is increasingly emphasizing the regionalization of, its security partnerships. So I think these type of issues that we're discussing today holds a very important place when we think about U.S. standing in Asia, the future of U.S. alliance network in the region, and actually for the future of international order.
Yeah, thank you. I think that's a really good, starting point. You had this situation where not just the United States, but the United States especially had identified Huawei as a risk that, to install gear manufactured and then expecting software updates from a Chinese manufacturer just led to the idea, fairly reasonable I think, that perhaps Chinese intelligence services might be able to leverage this gear for spying, espionage, et cetera. Maybe I'll turn to you at this point, Kemy. As working as a U.S. diplomat in the region and around the world, in the international relations literature, there's talk about states getting entangled in other states' disputes, and so if you're, and in the case of Huawei, right, the U.S. was asking various governments, not just in Asia but around the world, to shun this key Chinese company. Of course, as Colin mentioned in the last panel, the adversary gets a say, and so China could also turn to U.S. allies or partners and pressure them or impose costs for participating in a U.S.-led initiative. I wonder how you view the task of navigating that as a U.S. representative, and how you've observed reactions in the region where, let's suppose the U.S. has a good point, but these other states have to navigate based on their own interests, and in the case of South Korea and Japan, they live right next door to China, whether they like it or not.
Thanks, Graham, and it's really a pleasure to be here with you all today. This is a great topic. Huawei is really the perfect topic to think about these things. And the question for our panel was really about this, whether it's the US and China fighting with everyone else sort of taking the shrapnel, or whether everyone else is really part of the fight. And I think as a diplomat, by definition, it's not just bilateral, it's always multilateral. I worked at the UN too, so maybe I have a little bit of bias. But we're all in it together, and I think that's the way we've been feeling with our colleagues in Taiwan, Korea, and Japan for quite a while. I think the Open RAN plan made sense for everyone independently. It wasn't just the US saying, we don't trust Huawei, you shouldn't either. And that was really important. It was a great example. I do think that increasingly we have a multipolar world, and we need to be thinking in terms of everyone having their interests and taking their leadership. And I think Japan has stepped up in our eyes for a lot of reasons in a big way, especially recently in the US-China realm, because increasing their defense spending, doubling defense spending, getting very engaged in technologies, as we're talking about, especially defense techs, investing in Tomahawk missiles, doing co-production, building F-35s in Japan. That's not because we took their hand. It's because they have serious interests in the region. They have a tough balance. And I was asked to represent Japan, so I'm going in Japan. I can't actually think for Japan, but I can say what I'm hearing from colleagues as recently as yesterday and what they're doing. And I think that they obviously understand the importance. I think one interesting thing for Japan in all of this is the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific. That's what their value is. It's not that the US wants them not to use Huawei. They want peace. And that came from Prime Minister Abe in 2016. He coined that phrase, and all of us jumped on his bandwagon for a free and open Indo-Pacific. And the Japanese, because they're right there, you can see Taiwan from Yonaguni Island, and they've got the geography so close to China. They have these trade ties, these economic ties, which are really deep and getting deeper, which we can talk about if you're interested in that. And of course, historical ties, including the writing system that's Chinese that they use in Japan. So it's complicated, but one thing I'd like to point out about Japan is that they're really taking a multipolar leadership. You talked about TPP. When we pulled out, they jumped in, right? CPTPP was really Japan pushing, and they're still pushing for this alliance halo, right? That whether or not the US is in, even if the US pulls out, and you can go across the stage, including RCEP, where China is part of the trade agreement, but also on the alliance side, on the military security side, more and more cooperation in the South China Sea, from AUKUS to the Quad to NATO IP4. There's a lot about this alliance halo, and it's not just that the U.S. didn't like or saw real threats from Huawei.
Yeah. Thanks. Yeah, that's a good foundation for it. Jeremy, I think I'll turn to something that I found that you had written early this year after when the world was figuring out what DeepSeek meant. And you had a piece out sort of assessing this from the perspective of Taiwan. And an observation that I thought was really interesting was that you thought that the first island chain, meaning essentially Japan and Taiwan, but the Korean Peninsula is often thought of as part of that, it becomes really salient in the tech competition in specific at this moment, and being the DeepSeek moment. A couple of other things you said in there that I thought were interesting were you had this quote that says, maintaining control over the internal politics of East Asian allies who are vital to US compute supremacy will become as crucial as it was during the US-Soviet Cold War of the 1950s to the 70s. The key challenge lies, you say, in preventing these nations from pivoting toward China. So you're describing a dynamic of, essentially US-Chinese competition in the first island chain. Of course, you have the global center of the most advanced semiconductor manufacturing is is Taiwan, period, no competition. You have totally essential tooling coming from Japanese businesses. You have some of the most essential memory supplies, much of which is not really replaceable at scale in South Korea. From Washington, this region is sometimes thought of as the forward defense line in the Pacific against a hypothetical attack by, nowadays you worry about North Korea, China, Russia maybe, but it used to be Soviet Union now. But in the region, I mean, how do you describe that sense from the perspective of Taiwan or the Taiwanese government, however you want to characterize it? And I do want to just mention, I meant to say this earlier, that each person here is sort of selected on this panel, I think, to represent a major geography in the region, but each also has a very international perspective, so I don't want you to have to stay in your lane if you feel there is one. Feel free to cross lanes.
Yeah, thanks so much, Graham, for this great question. And then thanks so much, Andy, for inviting me again here in Stanford. This is my privilege and an honor to represent in Taiwan, although I don't think I can represent Taiwan 100%, but as the only panelist here from Taiwan, it's really my privilege to share the perspective from a down-to-earth Taiwan's position. So yeah, I mean, if you are discussing about why Taiwan has its position in terms of a semiconductor manufacturing, now you can look back, you trace back into the 4 years ago why Taiwanese decision makers decided to develop its industry into a B2B model that's pretty connected originally with the security concern. Because Taiwan was just excluded from the international platforms, from UN, from most of the international organizations in the end of the 70s. And then also the US broke up the diplomatic tie with Taiwan and then found the diplomatic ties with the PRC. And so the huge anxiety be shared among the Taiwan's community. So the Taiwanese policymakers, especially the industrial policymakers, decided, okay, so from now on, we got nothing. We just barely an agricultural industry, and maybe it's about to get industrialized. So the best strategy that we can do is we form a industry that can create a interdependent relations with the United States. And during the time, the Silicon Valley was about to outsource in the manufacturing part because the manufacturing part during the time was not efficient. And then Taiwan was really about to grab a chance to making sure that we can in charge of manufacturing things for all clients here in the Silicon Valley. So then we have a value because our US clients need to rely on our manufacturing capacity. And so that was the day one that Taiwanese national strategist has this kind of a concept based on national security thought. Of course, after decades and decades, the geopolitical situation has changed very, very dramatically. Taiwan has leveraged the Chinese market and leveraged the Chinese environment for decades during the era of globalization, because everybody was rushing into China for making China as a center for manufacturing. And so Taiwan played a kind of a central role to bridging the American capital, to bridging the American innovation, and to manufacturing devices to make all the innovations become tangible and can supply with the global scale during the era of globalization. But at the same time, there's a huge anxiety also shared among the Taiwanese community that, of course, we were rushing to China. We are rushing to China for investing. We are rushing to China to build up a skilled manufacturing activities there in China by Taiwanese managers, by Taiwanese capitals. But on the other hand, because China is so attractive to attract all the talents, all the capitals, all the whatever's to China, and if we don't just design some kind of economic security framework for ourselves, and we are eventually to be replaced by China, or maybe replaced by the demands of US clients to ask us just transfer the technology there to China. And so in the beginning of the globalization, Taiwan introduced the first of outbound investment screening mechanism. It was still the first country in the world, and why we introduced our outbound investment screening system in the beginning of our globalization, when everybody was thinking about, oh, the Cold War finally finished, the war is flat, we're just looking for the market. The market power is the only ruling power. There's no geopolitics. But Taiwan decided to play in the geopolitical game, to making sure that we can still control the flow of the capital, control the flow of the talents, and control the flow of the technology vis-a-vis China. Because again, that's another anxiety of not being able to survive. The first wave of the anxiety was not being able to survive because the US just ignored Taiwan. And the second anxiety is about totally absorbed by the Chinese. And so we have to maintain our survival. So we have to frame this kind of economic security framework. The last part is the recent part is after the escalation of the US-China grand competition, Taiwan is kind of a good luck, because after the grand competition, some part of the critical manufacturing activities have been moved out from China back to Taiwan. That caused a huge boom, also because of the AI boom happened. So it's very, very a coincidence, but the right time, that the escalation of the US-China competition, and the right time for the AI boom. So make Taiwan become the center for AI manufacturing. So everybody is too much focusing on the TSMC advanced node manufacturing capacity. But on the other hand, you have to look at the capacity for manufacturing AI servers. Then last year, even this year, Taiwan has been manufacturing the AI servers for the market share for 90%. So this is another truth. This is kind of about, because of a coincidence, because that US-China have been competing with each other. So Taiwan took advantage of this geopolitical dynamic that become the center. But on the other hand, another challenge linked with the survival issue is about everybody in the world thinking about semiconductor is too critical. Everybody wants to reshore the capacity of manufacturing semiconductor back into their own soil, especially our friends here in this nation. From the Biden administration, Chips and Science Act, until this administration demand Taiwan to reshore or to friendshore. We use the term friendshore. To friendshore the semiconductor manufacturing from the TSMC to build up the scale here in Arizona. But there comes the issue of the silicon shield. Whether Taiwan can still maintain its own silicon shield. What kind of approach, what kind of leverage that Taiwanese regulator, Taiwanese government can still leverage of this friendshoring trend in the current geopolitical landscape. But again, so we are always looking for survival in the very, very dynamic, but very, very hard situation for Taiwan in between the US and China grand powers. The rationale or the logic for Taiwanese survival is pretty much the same, that we have to be still irreplaceable and indispensable for, firstly, the clients, and the secondly, maybe the most critical clients is the US clients here in Silicon Valley. I think that's the national strategy. No matter the situation changed, that's just the same strategy has been shared among the Taiwanese national strategists for decades and decades.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think that's a really, all three of these comments have pointed something out that I wanted to make sure that we got to, and we didn't have to wait very long, which is that the big geopolitical story in the newspapers and in foreign affairs is US-China. But the experience of individual countries is their own, right? And in the case of Taiwan, this highly acute sense of existential, the existential threat of Taiwanese society and government as we know it, has been especially acute since the United States and the PRC normalized relations. South Korea has basically existential threat ongoing since the Korean War, in which the United States is completely integrated. Japan may not face the same acute existential threat, but is right in the region with Taiwanese Strait or Korean Peninsula flashpoints and heavy integration into a military alliance with the United States. So these are sort of individual stories that bring their own independent logic of positioning. And what I wanted to raise next, I think, is this is a question I'm going to ask each of you. And you can sort of take it whichever direction you want. But we talk about a technological competition or a technological race, especially in the case of AI. I wonder how you all think we should view the positionality of the three countries we're talking about, or other regional countries. Are they on the US team? Is Korea, Japan, Taiwan, are they on the US team in an AI race? Or are they embroiled in some more complex dynamic because of such a race? Is the idea of a race just not that accurate a portrayal of what's going on? I mean, is there a problem of a race to what and all that kind of thing? I mean, how do you view that? And I'll start on the other side again, just to keep things moving. But yeah, I mean, and I'll say this too: if embroiled in the race, is it, would folks in general be happy to be on the U.S. team, or is this more of a, well, here we are, let's see what happens?
In 2025, earlier this year, President Lee Jae-myung was actually being asked almost the exact same question when he was giving a talk at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And his answer was, yes, we're in, on those issues where US and China compete that matter for national security of us, we're US ally, we're in. But then he also added, because we're so geographically proximate to China, we're going to also have to manage relations with Beijing very well. So that was, his answer. So I think it probably is helpful to trace back to the first US ban, say May 2019 on Huawei. Probably it's not a secret that South Korean politics, like in many other parts of the world, is divided between conservatives and progressives. Right at that time, it was under the progressive government as the ruling party. So at that time, like I briefly mentioned, the response to this question was, I remember then Ambassador Harris was actually pressuring or urging South Korean government to ban Huawei, and then South Korean presidential office back then actually, pushed back. And then, there's some sentiments of alliance going through some difficulties because then, Ambassador Harris said, then we're going to have to consider how we may have to withdraw information, blah, blah, blah. But then the following administration under, Yoon Suk-yeol, this time South Korea was very well out there to join the hands with the United States and Japan to pursue these tripartite security cooperation agenda, including in the Pacific and AI and all these other things. So there was that time period, and now, we have the new president back to the progressive government, being the ruling party. But I think this administration is trying to really emphasize practicality in approaching this set of issues. So my answer to your question is, yes, South Korea is an ally of the United States. South Korea will actually pursue the same set of goals that concern AI. And these, are under the framework of modernizing alliances. And this actually brings Tokyo, Seoul, Washington together. It's the shared goal. It's there. But when it comes to how it's actually being implemented, just last week, there was China, South Korea having the summit meeting, and there President Xi suggested and urged that two countries explore the possibility of cooperation on AI. So we're going to see how Seoul, the current government, navigates this very delicate, talking about the positionality. So I think a lot is, we'll have to see how things turn out. But the basic position is, yes, South Korea is in.
Interesting. Kemy, do you want to take a hack at this?
Sure.
Sorry to answer it, speaking for the U.S. So however you...
Three of us are U.S. citizens on this panel, by the way. So
yeah.
I hate to assume anything from your thoughts, but I'm really interested in the way you asked that question. Are you on the U.S. team and this whole bilateral, these two are fighting? I really feel like all our allies are brilliant, and the strategy that Jeremy just described of Taiwan is brilliant. I mean, really smart, and the practicality that the Koreans take to it is, in my opinion, our current president is very practical too, and maybe we haven't been as practical in the past, but practical sounds like thinking about your interests and the interests of your nation first. And those are very complex, and it is balancing economic and wealth issues with national security and military issues. I do see the Koreans all in with the multilateral exercises in the South China Sea. Seems like that is something that has been really good early on, even with communications between the Japanese and Koreans, even before the Camp David trilat, the Koreans and the Japanese and the Americans and the Australians and the Kiwis and others were engaging militarily very well. On the economic side, I see a lot of things changing fast, and it's a little bit a brave new world. And these kinds of meetings around as recently as last week with Xi suggest that there are deals being made and things are moving quickly. I saw with some alarm that the Japanese FDI in China has increased 55% over the last 3 quarters of 2025 after slow decline 60% over the last 7 or 8 years. Everybody is, seeing what they can do and thinking about what works, not to do a Huawei, not to jump on board some system that will be penetrable, but to think about where to spend their money and hedge their bets with everyone, including the President of the United States, thinking about national interests first very explicitly. That worries me on the diplomatic multilateral front. If we are, the earlier panel was talking about how energy for AI means we need climate. We need people thinking about climate. Are we thinking about climate? Are any of us thinking about climate? Are any of us thinking about the global common goods and the multilateral? Or are we all starting to be practical? Practical is the nicest way to say it. As a diplomat, I'm not sure practical is what I want, but I'd love to hear from others.
Yeah, Jeremy, how do you view it?
Yeah, so if you're asking this question to the Taiwanese supply chain participants, their answer is going to be very simple. they're going to say, we're with the clients, because we are a hardware contract manufacturing defined ecosystem. We don't have a brand, we don't have a brand owners, so what you can do is just you're aligned with your clients. Wherever your clients is, we are with them. That's the market rationale for the B2B contract manufacturers to survive. But the thing is, of course, not so simple. It's so complex in terms of Taiwan's geopolitical situation. But comparatively, in the recent years, I think Taiwan actually enjoyed kind of a good luck that our industry eventually chose to leave the U.S. team. The U.S. team is still, from previously to currently, still the most valuable clients. Because the Silicon Valley innovation has been maintain its position for leading the innovation and for leading the market, still maintain their dominant position to define the market. So whenever Apple was dominating power, we were supplying for Apple. The whole ecosystem there in Taiwan were supplying for Apple. In these 3 years, NVIDIA replaced Apple's role. So the whole ecosystem there in Taiwan flexibly changed their services from previously Apple to currently NVIDIA. So it's kind of a lucky for Taiwan because our industrial foundation can always align with the US clients. Just I'm quoting Morris Chang mentioned. So we're just dancing with the clients. So if the US can maintain its position as the most valuable clients, then we're still, I think, no doubtfully that Taiwan is always aligned with the US clients and then with the US national interest here. But we're in the watershed now. So we kind of released a series of reports mentioning about the potential that the China replace US's role, not only in the DeepSeek event, but also there's a lot of evidences just because 10 years ago when China announced their grand strategy, Made in China 2025, and this year is the year of 2025, you can see they almost achieved their goal to dominate the critical manufacturing sectors, or whatever, for ship making, car making, maybe besides to chip making. The chip making is still dominated by Taiwan, but all the other critical manufacturing activities, we even discussed this morning about the undersea cable manufacturing. Almost all the parts of the manufacturing parts is about or already been dominated by the Chinese. And so whether we can control or manage this kind of a trend. So the US, of course, is still leading the innovation part. But if the PRCs want to compete with China, with the US, I think they're going to have more and more strategy. So we very carefully to watching the Chinese trend. Of course, we have a huge anxiety now that firstly, China want to compete with the US in different battleground. Because the US have a huge confidence that we can define the battlefield. We want to compete with China. But actually the PRC's strategic thought is like, no, we don't want to compete with the most advanced AI. We don't want to compete with the computing power, or we are competing with you in the different kind of a battleground that we can define. So manufacturing sectors, obviously, China has advantage. They've leveraged their own industrial strategy. They've been leading the competition, the brutal competition within the Chinese ecosystem. So that make the Chinese ecosystem become not efficient. They don't have efficiency, but become very effectively to replace the Western players' role in terms of manufacturing sectors. If this trend become, if we can control this trend, I think now we are suffering from a process that either be absorbed by the Chinese dominated ecosystem, or eventually replaced by them because they're creating an indigenized, just Glenn this morning mentioned, indigenized the ecosystem for their own national security reason. We don't know because we are not driven power. It's not like the U.S. We're supplying kind of positive recommendations for our U.S. friends here. But the U.S. should take a leading position, should take the leadership in order to making sure we can still jointly to dominate the future of AI, because that's going to dramatically change the way of human civilization.
Right. Well, so what I think is so fascinating about this is that there is this, what we have from this series of perspectives is, U.S. allies are, significantly on the U.S. side if there's a race on, because our interests are intertwined. There's a lot of business and security elements, but it's not the same attitude that you might find in Washington, where you can just say, well, and nuts to China. Let's see if we can completely shut them out of everything. That's just not going to work for the business environment in South Korea or Japan, or even in Taiwan, although I think obviously the strategic and existential security perspective in Taiwan is much more acute with the PRC specifically. But the way that tech, and so I'm just saying that because it's not as much of a syndrome here in Silicon Valley, but in Washington there is this kind of this tendency to see China as the thing, and U.S. allies as either being successfully on our side or just assumed to be on our side, whichever we it is. And if they're not, then they're just being difficult and stupid. I mean, that kind of underlying attitude is found in more in think tanks, I think, than in government. I mean, officials do try to do a good job. I'm not trying to, but there is a blindness for people who don't actually deal with the allies and partners in the region. But in that context, I find it striking that in some of these cases, geopolitics is causing the technological conflict points. Without a geopolitical dynamic between U.S. allies and China, the Huawei situation would not be nearly as acute for many countries. Because without, if you weren't situated as a U.S. ally, then, of course you probably would prefer not to be completely infiltrated by a foreign intelligence service, but it doesn't have the same relevance if you aren't host to a bunch of U.S. bases or something. On the other hand, in the case of Taiwan and the chip-making industry, their change in technology and the salience of large-scale machine learning changes the geopolitical situation. So it's, and as Jeremy's described a couple of times, it first transforms the focus and the importance of Taiwan to the United States in a geopolitical strategic sense. And then it also threatens to displace the general Taiwanese strategy of being essential to the United States because Taiwan is not a treaty ally of the United States. The U.S. hasn't committed explicitly to defending Taiwan, although it may, and sometimes, President Biden would say, oh, we're definitely going to do it, and then everyone would walk it back, and then we'd do it again. And, there's a strategic ambiguity, as we all know, if we follow that issue. But, Taiwan's insecurity, well, both security and insecurity right now, I think, are significantly shaped by the change in technology. So it's not a single package. It's not a single technological competition, and it's not a single dynamic back and forth with, in terms of how technology changes the geopolitics. We have to look at which technology, which states are involved, and really which dilemma it is. If it's about ICT infrastructure, that's one question. If it's about supply of crucial inputs to what many people think will be a transformative round of technology, it's sort of a separate ecosystem. I have a bunch of questions, but and so I can come back to them if we run dry out here. But I want to turn to the audience. We have about a little over half an hour, and I may slot in a couple of my remaining burning questions in between. But I thought it'd be fun to just get out into the room. So I see my first hand here, Johanna Costigan in the front.
Thanks. In the previous panel, I think Glenn pointed out the companies kind of have their own foreign policy. And I'm struck listening to the Huawei example that the South Korean government's response was let the companies make up their minds. Jeremy's description fits with what I've studied in the Taiwan example, where TSMC might be a little bit ahead of the government, and then the government goes along with what TSMC says. That's an oversimplification. But I'm just wondering, in these three countries and also in the US, how do we think about the barrier between government and big tech? We've had influential industries in the past, but it seems like in this era there's a little bit of a difference in the balance of power. We all watch as Jensen Huang conducts his diplomacy independently, and TSMC's head is the one meeting with Trump, right? So I think that there is potentially just a different kind in addition to degree in the AI era. So how are all these countries handling that division? And do they want to co-opt industry more or guide it more? Who has the power and who should?
Who wants to take that? Anybody?
Yeah. Oh, well, I cannot represent the TSMC. Yeah. If you look at friendshoring negotiation, if you look at who was standing in the Oval Office with the president mentioned about the new investment, and if you look at the deal between Japan and Germany there for friendshoring cases, you cannot see any existence of Taiwanese officials. Because again, Taiwan is still kind of taboo for even our allies to embrace, because that's going to absolutely provoke China. So on the other hand, TSMC is the driven power for the global technology development. It's the most critical infrastructures for the AI. So definitely TSMC might have more bargaining chips than the Taiwanese government to play this geopolitical game. But TSMC is just like all the globalists, because businessmen are the globalists. It's just like Jensen, it's just like Apple, just like Amazon, Microsoft here. The globalist businessmen, they're pursuing for their benefit. They're pursuing for their market share. They're not pursuing for the survival of Taiwan. Maybe just there is a coincidence that Taiwan is still the best environment for TSMC to keep growing. So as a policymakers, what is the grand strategy for the Taiwanese policymaker? Of course, we want leverage TSMC's grand power. But it's just not, we can 100% convert TSMC's power into Taiwan's national power. The grand strategy adopted by the Taiwanese government or policymakers, they just want to follow the TSMC's friendshoring trend and trying to have some voices and by leverage whatever we can leverage, and also provide with TSMC and the manufacturing ecosystem here stick to the other nations' ecosystem, because this is still the only ecosystem on the world doesn't need subsidies, still can run efficiently itself. So I think this is the irreplaceable part for Taiwan, and this is the card for Taiwanese government. But how to play the card, how to use this card to achieve our national interests, I think this is still multi-layer strategy. So if I got a chance, I can further share it up with you, but I'm just wrap up here now.
Go ahead. Please.
Should get on the line. So just to foot stomp what Jeremy said, if the question is who's in control or who should be in control, it's complicated, but both right? You definitely need both. You need the companies pushing the government. You need the government pulling the companies. We need the government investing in sectors that we think are important in a quasi-industrial policy kind of way. Where'd Andy go? We need the government investing in R&D and doing that kind of university investing that brings up these novel ideas in across the way. We need the government regulating so things don't go too far off the wires, but we also need capitalism working and the best and brightest getting ahead and all of that. I see it really differently in each of our countries, even though the fundamentals are the same. And Korea and Taiwan and Japan are really interesting historical examples of where companies had more power than government, and government came in. Certainly the Chinese have government having more power, and there's some advantage to that. But that's definitely not our halo of alliance model.
In terms of South Korean companies, just to go back to 2019 when it was first announced to ban Huawei, of the three companies that work on the 5G network, so LG U+ is the only country that they maintain their position and then still uses Huawei equipment. Their market share, is relatively smaller than the other two, SK and KT. In 2020, U.S. government made the non-U.S. companies to get okay from the United States government to, because they use U.S. technology when they actually, export their parts to China, to Huawei. So my observation is that, say, Samsung and SK Hynix, they try and keep it a low profile. They actually have operations in China. It's very important not to unnecessarily provoke troubles. So they go with U.S. government, laws, and then they apply for the permission, and they got it, and so they're navigating. I know. They are very keen on collecting what U.S. information about what U.S. is thinking, which is not very easy these days. And I actually hear from these, companies, what they want the most is, I think it was brought up in the previous panel, predictability. It's okay to go this direction, that direction. I just need to know so that I can actually plan my business. So that's what I can tell. And, I think in terms of the relationship between South Korean government and these global companies, I actually also find this striking. It's well said. Global technology companies have their own foreign policies, and they, what I can tell is, say, both SK Hynix and Samsung applied to be able to utilize the Chips and Science Act. But as you can imagine, some of the requirement in order for you to apply, you actually apparently have to share a lot of business secret information. So I think at that point in time, the South Korean government jumped in and actually tried to talk to the U.S. government. It's a bit too much, and so government does play a role to make sure that these companies that are very important. It's South Korean industrial policy in a sense to be able to continue to survive. So it's I think one of those areas that's becoming extremely interesting, where global technology companies are actually becoming active players in global geopolitics, right? And I'm really fascinated by these developments that are taking place compared to, say, even 30 years ago or 20 years ago.
Yeah. Do we have a next question? I have one that I'm happy to ask. Maybe I'll do that now, but please think of if you have others. One thing that keeps kind of, I think we're, in previous panels, we were talking specifically about AI competition and about what might happen in terms of different aspects of that. There's there's an element of speculation and betting going on in the AI competition, AI race narrative. And the sharpest way that I think about it is that embedded in the US-led semiconductor controls is the bet that these chips will be relevant to a strategically relevant advance in technology during the time before China is able to replicate this supply chain, right? So people have a lot of different visions of what this means. For some, it means AGI or superintelligence. There's this concept of durable strategic advantage, where if one entity, may call it a country or something, gains a certain technological advance, and then there's this runaway, self-accelerating development of the technology, that would lead to a durable advantage that is insurmountable because you didn't get there first. There's all sorts of different things, but that might not happen. It might happen or it might not. And if it does happen, if the emergence of that type of technology does occur, it could happen before or after the Chinese ecosystem is able to. We don't know that it will ever get there, but most people think probably Chinese innovators and both, individuals and companies will be able to figure out how to make roughly equivalently powerful chip-making equipment and then chips over time. So the bet there is, and I'm going to ask each of you briefly if you wish to take a side on this bet. I am agnostic. I'm a skeptic of huge technological claims, just because I hear them all the time. And out of 10 people who tell you they're going to reinvent the world with their company, all 10 are probably wrong, but one of them might be right. So I'm a skeptic, but I'm an agnostic on whether this big moment is coming. But it's just strategically relevant question because it might. So I'm curious if you have a view on is AI going in the direction of something like durable strategic advantage, or is it more likely to settle in a significant but not world-changing technological development, a bunch of jobs changing, industries transform, certain supply chains? No one's saying it's not a big deal, but it might or might not be redefining. You can tell me if you want whether you think it is, but the question is, what if it's not the big thing? What if the result is we go on for the next 10 or 15 years and there's significant economic upheaval. There's certainly some military aspects of things, technologies and capabilities and balances that change, but fundamentally it's a moderate to big event rather than a world-changing event. What happens then to the geopolitical significance of the technology? I guess I'll start with Jeremy because we just started with you on the last one, unless you.
Yeah.
Sorry to throw it right at you. I know it's a big question, and you can be agnostic. Like I said.
Well, so this is kind of ironic because now Taiwan is the arsenal of AI. So because of the AI boom, Taiwan's economy is booming. It's dramatically booming. If you look at the GDP growth of this year, continually the second quarter and third quarter is reached to about 8% of the GDP growth. In the annual year of 2025, it's about to reach to the 6 or 7% of the GDP growth. It's just like performing like a developing country in the early stage of economic growth. So we are on this train because performing as a arsenal of AI. But of course, this is a bubble. On the other hand, so there is a huge anxiety share among even TSMC and all the other AI manufacturing suppliers. They've been curious about whether this kind of a trend can continue, whether it's already overestimated. Of course, there is a huge downturn coming soon or later. So for Taiwan's strategy, again, we don't have many positions there for playing a huge big games, like for even consuming the computing power. As a major suppliers for these AI AI hardware. We barely purchase the NVIDIA GPUs because the NVIDIA is just selling their GPUs for the biggest clients, either here in the US or finding some way to selling that for another end consumers, mostly in the PRC. So yeah, maybe NVIDIA is going to still keep developing for a couple of years, and AI might dramatically reshape the global culture or the global order, or might just partially changing the way that we are living. But as a supplier here now, what we been keeping thinking is about how to leverage our position in terms of the advanced manufacturing supply chain, still help the clients to make the innovation become the tangible, embodied intelligence, tangible tools. And by leveraging that kind of a position to making sure whatever the innovation happen or whether or not the innovation happen, we still have a value to be recognized as a survival de facto sovereign state.
Right. So stay in the spotlight one way or the other. Right.
Yep.
Great.
I can't find the path in my head to see agnostic. I just can't see it. I think it's revolutionary. I think it's going to change so many things. Even if we take out that whole part we were talking about last night about if it's superhuman and it's able to take over the world and do horrible things and go rogue, even if you take that apart, which is really scary and would really change everything. Even if it doesn't go there, and I think it might not go there, if that's what you mean by agnostic, then I agree with you, it might not. But just every day-to-day thing has already changed, and the ability to do things faster and smarter and more efficiently and change the whole labor supply, it's definitely going to impact it. I think that, and I come from a policy perspective, not a tech perspective, right? From a policy perspective, I think more than ever we need alliances, we need diplomatic discussions, we need people to be thinking about how to use it for good and not for evil, to be very simplistic and very direct. And there are so many ways we can use it for good, but there are non-state actors and terrorists and other people who might be much worse than practical. Practical's good. So we have to be thinking about the governance and how to use it now.
I don't know if I know enough to be able to say anything wide, but let me actually turn the question around and say, what if AI is not as revolutionary as we believe it to be? What's going to happen in terms of geopolitics in the region? Now, I think right now in the 21st century, I mean, it has always been throughout history, but what's really defining about US-China competition really is how national security, economy, and technological dimensions of US-China competition is so interlinked. It's really impossible to separate them out. But if we just take out the technology part, if we are somehow able to separate economy and national security, then I actually see the return. It's possible that we have the return of more traditional geopolitics, where and in that sense, I think what could happen is U.S. allies, for example, actually prior to the intensification of U.S.-China competition, their probably ideal scenario of their foreign policy of handling this is really continue to strengthen its alliance relationship with Washington for their national security and manage good enough relations with Beijing so that they can ensure their economic prosperity is there. But what really made the AI and other technological dimension made impossible is that it's just not possible to separate them. So if AI is not as revolutionary as we believe it to be, then maybe there are some incentives on the part of US allies to go back and actually forge relations with Beijing, And probably the nature of the threat is going to be a lot clearer than blurry. We talked about this, how cyber, it's very difficult to have this attribution of the attacker, who's responsible for anything. And part of the debates within South Korea, about Huawei, for example, is they weren't sure, whether Huawei actually does indeed pose a national security threat. I mean, this is different assessments. That's the thing about this whole thing. Threat perceptions, or those are future risks associated with AI as opposed to manifested damage. So it's difficult to bring the allies together. But if it's not there, then we probably go back to more traditional alliance politics, where people feel nervous. The U.S. may withdraw their troops, and all that old days. But I do not think we're going back there.
Yeah, well, I mean, what you're describing is a little bit, to me, like what I was alluding to before about maybe there's an amount of decoupling that is good, that's not too much, but is just enough that the various countries can feel secure in dealing with each other confidently. That's the dream for me, personally, is that somehow I don't see a path to comprehensively friendly relations between the United States and China without radical changes in our countries. But I can imagine a future where, with some pretty significant changes, of course, from where we're headed right now, these two countries figure out ways, both technological, diplomatic, and otherwise, to reduce some interdependence that scares us right now, and to build some defenses that make us more confident in our security, because the insecurity in China is felt extremely deeply as well. It's not just an American fixation. And then, as I say, to ideally then be able to deal with each other more confidently, like I say, not comprehensively friendly, but do business where we can, and say, oh, well, we won't do this. This makes us feel insecure, but we can work on these things, and we can work on these global problems, and we can also face the common threats that might emerge from the change of technology. My agnosticism, for the record, doesn't go to down to the level of maybe AI is completely insignificant. Okay, it's a big deal, but I'm not decided on whether it's approaching a sort of takeoff moment where everything sort of changes rapidly in this comprehensive way that radicalizes national power. I think that's sort of possible, but maybe not, and maybe not in the time scale where the geopolitics we have today is still, looking the same. We have a great deal of political dynamism and instability potential in both the United States and China, and many other countries. So, do we have any other questions around the room? We have a few more minutes. Andy.
Is there a perspective in the region on sort of which country is best poised to, quote unquote, win the AI race, the U.S. or China? Is there a move to put money on one horse versus the other? Is it even if it's sort of a whisper, not said out loud?
You know what you can't say, right?
Well, I just previously mentioned about maybe China's grand strategy is winning the competition, not in the battlefield, not defined by the U.S., but defined by them. So you see many of the evidence that they are trying to make this become true. For example, recent documents based on our watching. So we've been keeping analyzing the Chinese context, keeping watching the Chinese discussion, and so they almost achieved Made in China 2025, and they're aiming for standards, China standards 2025. So if they can define the standards and whatever the computer within the NVIDIA's hand, it might be not the standard of the US standard might be not the global standard. Or even the US standard is the standard of the most advanced AI. Then China still want to dominate in another part of AI, say Edge AI. We kind of discussed it this morning and a couple of days recently. I think China has a huge ambitious goal for dominating the Edge AI or even the physical AI, because they are still much good at the tangible manufacturing part and humanoid robotics and those stops. And if the U.S. cannot reindustrialize itself, or if the U.S. Silicon Valley cannot redefine the manufacturing activities, I don't see there's a bright future for the U.S. and the alliance to join that still dominate the manufacturing parts. Keeping pessimistic will always help us to thinking about how to survive it, and then we have the best solution. So, we are still always being put into the front line. So every day we have to be thinking about what kind of the worst scenario that we are facing, and then we just making sure we can overcome that kind of worst scenario, just making sure we still survive.
Interesting how you think about getting your head around that very scary question where there's only one answer, and that's that China doesn't win, right? But the only way China doesn't win is exactly this, thinking about how they could and thinking about what we need to do. And in addition to what Jeremy was saying, China has resolved by 2049 to dominate the world economy and dominate the military defense. So that's not too far away. And they're doing great on fighter jets and all of these other things we've been talking about. So we have to be very aware. But still, we have the asymmetrical advantage of alliances, back to the halo. And that, I think, means everything. And that means that we will have Open RAN instead of Huawei, because we'll share the information on the threat so people know the practical answer. There's a lot we need to do. I think communications is key. There was an article in Foreign Affairs a couple days ago by my old boss, Kurt Campbell, about the communication breakdown. And when I was working at the NSC with him, that was a huge issue, right? I mean, back in the Cuban Missile Crisis, it was messengers and writing, and it took a couple days. We have much better technology than that, but we do have to answer the phones, and right now China is not answering the phone for us. So we really have to think about all levels of engagement, not just rules of AI or even free trade or non-free trade agreements, but also communications and diplomacy and thinking the way that people who are not us think, which is the hardest thing, I think, figuring out, not doing the mirrored image thing, but thinking about how China's thinking. And one of the scary things is that China can take much more pain than we can because of the nature of their system, just like Russia's taking an awful lot of pain right now, and that war's still going on. So how do we deal with that? We have to keep talking. Things like this among academics and policymakers are really important.
If the question is who's poised to win between China and the United States within South Korean sentiments, to be honest, I have not actually seen any data, scientific answer to this. But the sentiment in South Korea has always been the United States is the number one country. But lately, that the image actually has undergone some changes. So it's very in flux, let me say. And if you ask this question to, say, government officials, which political party, and the military or the public, I actually think you probably will get somewhat varied responses. So I actually do not know the answer, sorry.
Well, I'll just say, as somebody who engages with Chinese counterparts on a pretty regular basis, and I was in Beijing last week for a Track 2 dialogue, I think there's it depends what we're talking about in terms of winning. You know, what's the destination? And I think there are some people in China who hope that their positionality, which is not the one that they've chosen regarding chips especially, will turn out to be advantageous. And something that I find fascinating is in this field of unknowns about the technological progress, you know, the big US labs are betting that they can do something absolutely transformative with insane scale. And so this is how we're talking about trillions of dollars of investment, which, you know, if you think about, if somebody told you that 5 years ago, you'd just be like, how are we, this is insane. These people are nuts. But, you know, it's a real possibility that this stuff could build into a hugely capable and profitable and geopolitically relevant technology. But if scale doesn't do it, if you just get, you know, if you get diminishing returns to compute scale, China doesn't have access to as many chips, so they simply can't spend the trillions of dollars on the investment. So they don't stand to lose if that bubble bursts in the same way, and instead the ecosystem there is absolutely focused on figuring out how to get applications working and get, you know, and then there's a huge amount of work on embodied AI and figuring out how to automate systems and build on the existing manufacturing capabilities where that's relevant. So there's a potential sense of winning without knowing what the final destination is that could be achieved in China if the bet on scale changing the world doesn't come through. So I think that should be you know, that should make investors very nervous. I'm not sure it's actually that big of a deal geopolitically because there'd be a lot of money wasted in the United States, but we'd still have access to really excellent technology unless China uniquely builds industrial capabilities that then do build its you know, military and economic ecosystem into something that the United States and its allies can't match. But I don't fear that on the near horizon. I think it's possible that if the bet on scale doesn't work out, there's going to be a lot of money wasted, and that's going to mess up the markets here at minimum. So anyway, with that, we've just come up to time. We have a 15-minute break. I want to thank our panelists for a fascinating discussion. This really helped show us how individual countries, governments, societies have positionality and aren't even united as one. Their companies have their own interests, and it all fits into an arc that's bigger than technology. It's bigger than just AI. If we're talking about technology, it's going to be an ongoing story, and we could spend an entire 2-day conference on geopolitics in East Asia in 2025, which sounds like a lot of fun, actually, but that's another conversation. For now, thanks to our panelists.